Hi Cindy, what do we think about the Booker Prize? Yeah? No? Are you hiding? I can't quite tell. Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm back on my shortlist nonsense of going back and reading some of the old shortlists from the Booker Prize. We are about to find out the long list fairly soon for the 2022 Booker Prize, and I thought, why not look back at 1972, 50 years ago, where we had this shortlist of only 4 books, but still books nonetheless that went on to, in many ways, have their own little lives. Some of them less well known, some of them much better known. But here is the shortlist from 1972. And I'll start off with the winner, John Berger with G. And I reviewed this recently in a weekly wrap-up. And it was the last of the list for me to finally read. And this was in some ways a controversial winner back at the time, not only because it's quite sexually explicit at times, not only because it involves swear words, which some of the delicate sensibilities of the judges did not appreciate, but also it is quite sexual in nature. And then the winner, after he won, donated his prize winnings to a movement in Sri Lanka, and so there was also this sort of political element to it that kind of added to the sort of the thing after the win. But the book itself is this sort of Casanova style figure called G, who sort of travels around parts of Europe, mostly sort of just sleeping his way around in some ways. That's a very broad overview for the book, but I think it does quite a few beautiful things in the background. It's a book that is a lot around relationships, and particularly this sort of budding youth and all of those sorts of things. But it also has, he's sort of caught in some ways in the politics of the world around him, and in many ways he's just this character wanting to get home, wanting to sort of find peace, and in many ways just finding relationships. And it's such an interesting book. I can see why it won. There's a real dynamism and a real force to it, and the narrative 50 years later still feels quite fresh to me, at least. Maybe I'm not the best judge of this, like, how do you do, fellow kids? But it's there's something quite fresh and dynamic about it, in the sense that it has a really strong point of view. It's not caught in an old world kind of language almost in the way it writes. There's a sort of an urgency to the way it talks about things. It's not always a perfect novel for me, but I can absolutely see why it won. And that was G, our winner from there. But now let's look at the other 3 books that were on that shortlist. So as mentioned, this is only a shortlist of 4, and this was quite weird for the time, seemingly. I mean, this is only the 4th year of the prize, but this is sort of the first time, and for a while afterwards, that sort of the prize sort of seemed to deviate a bit to sort of work out how long the shortlists would be, before sort of settling on 6 as the sort of standard number. But next up, alphabetically, was Susan Hill with The Bird of Night, and I adored this book. I spoke about it months ago, but essentially it is the story of the relationship between these 2 men, and particularly where one of the men is suffering from really troubling mental health, and sort of his sort of sense of reality is shifting quite substantially. And so the other characters in the book are really trying to reach out and look after this man, but it's so dark and deep, and he's sort of trapped in it, that ultimately we sort of just know that it's not going to end particularly well. And I just found this book really poignant. I think it's a really stunning book that deals a lot with such a depth of sort of understanding. This book, I think, particularly given, you know, current understandings of mental health and what they might have been 50 years ago, this book is actually quite remarkable for how insightful it is, and how I don't think it really lingers in kind of anything like pity. It sort of understands that there's something going on. There's a sort of private battle being fought by this man, and ultimately all the other characters are sort of trying to just understand his reality, and particularly this sort of close relationship between the 2 men at the heart of this book I just found really beautiful and really profound. There's something so deep and clever about it, and Susan Hill sort of known as well in some ways for a few of her other books being a bit more on the horror side, like the Haunting of Hill House and a few other things. I think that was her. But nonetheless, just a book that is just so stunning and gorgeous, and I really, really loved it. Yeah, this is my personal winner for the prize based on this shortlist of 4. Quick editor Bob moment here. Realised I entirely mixed up the names there. Shirley Jackson wrote The Haunting of Hill House. Susan Hill, I think, is where I went wrong because of the Hills thing. Susan Hill wrote The Woman in Black. So there we go. Anyway, editor Bob, peace out. Next up, we have The Chant of Jimmie Blacksmith by Thomas Keneally. And this book deals a lot with this central Aboriginal character at the heart of the book. And he is sort of marked out as different from many people because of his sort of heritage. He is kind of caught between being sort of an Indigenous person whose parents are kind of mixed, right? He's got one parent who I believe was white and one who is Aboriginal, and the tricky thing is he sort of then is based on sort of a real life story, but it's tricky within the book just because he's sort of caught, he's not really able to fit into society particularly easily. On the one hand, he is not particularly he can't read and write particularly well. He's sort of caught by people who automatically see him as wrong by the colour of his skin and just sort of know that he's different and mark him out as different. But he never really sits in any place. And he also, as a result, in some ways, has no other option but to turn to certain actions that maybe are not the wisest, you know, sort of his way of acting out within that to be able to get what he needs is not always the wisest, and he's sort of then really caught. It's quite a difficult thing, and it's quite a beautiful story. I mean, again, I don't think it's perfect, and I think perhaps the book is not fully aged. Thomas Keneally himself has sort of said that he would write it a bit differently today if he had the chance, but it was then turned into a film and it became this whole thing as well. But yeah, Thomas Keneally, this is not the first, this is not the last time we'll see him on these shortlists. He gets shortlisted a lot, but this is a really interesting book, and I think it shows quite a lot of Thomas Keneally's sort of ability to kind of take a grand sweeping story and do something quite interesting with it, to sort of take a big historical moment and look at the people who are kind of caught in between. An interesting story, quite a short one, and I think also just quite an interesting one, albeit with the problems that Thomas Keneally himself has identified. And last but not least, we have Pasmore by David Storey, who would then also go on to be shortlisted again and win. Actually, that's quite interesting with the early stages of the prize, because you see quite a few big name authors who perhaps weren't big at the time in the same way, but then went on to either win the prize or to have quite big literary careers. And Pasmore is about a man who has a breakdown and leaves his wife. And if this feels like a well-trodden tale, yes. we get this story quite a lot. I think luckily, I will say, for this, in this book's defense, it doesn't fall into the same trap that some books in this way do, of like the man leaves his wife and then he sort of, the book is sort of laced with this weird misogyny of like, well, isn't his life so great now that he hasn't got a nagging woman on his arm? You know, like that trope in the genre is overplayed and quite grim. And what I think is actually quite interesting about this is it sort of played a little bit for laughs at first. We sort of see that this man sort of makes his decision to leave his wife is so almost spontaneous in a way that's very passive, if that makes sense. So he sort of leaves his wife sort of like, oh, I can go over here and do this thing now, guess I will, and just does it. And it's so bizarre because so often we sort of see this as like after a big dramatic fight or chasing someone else. In fact, he sort of goes on to try and flirt with somebody and have this sort of affair. Most of this affair is in his head, and as we find out increasingly, he has sort of quite a lot of underlying mental health issues that are sort of part of that. And at one point he's really trying to persuade a nun to sleep with him, and he's sort of not in this sort of sense of like a challenge, more just because he's so sort of like, oh yeah, cool, do we do this? I don't know. Is this what people do? So it's quite quite a bizarre book. I really enjoyed it when I read it. Was a little bit like, huh, like it's not a perfect book, but it was sort of a reader took us, but just a little strange, a little on the odd side to sort of have, yeah, all of this jazz going on. But at the same time, there is something quite profound at the heart of it. This book does look at mental health in quite an interesting way, of sort of, this man has basically reached this breakdown. Part of his passivity is because he almost doesn't have the brain power to do any thinking anymore. His wife is convinced that he's having an affair just because he seems so cold and cut off to her. But actually he is just cold and cut off because he has nothing more to give mentally. And so it's really quite interesting that it sort of varies between being quite funny and quite absurd, and then incredibly sad and poignant. And so I think it's quite an interesting one in the mix. But that takes us to the shortlist. It feels so weird getting to this point so quickly, but this is what happens when you only have 4 books. And as I mentioned, Susan Hill's book would have been my choice for the winner. I think it's just a stunning, stunning book. I think it's really beautifully told, very lyrical, but also just incredibly good at getting inside characters' heads. But actually, of the 4 of this shortlist, I quite enjoyed generally. I thought it was actually a fun one. I say fun, well, 2 of the books deal with, 3 of the books deal with quite difficult, big issues, and it's only G that's the slightly funnier one, really, at the heart of it. But a really interesting set of books, and I do really recommend checking out, particularly Susan Hill, but any of these 4 if they sound interesting to you. They can be a little bit harder to get hold of. Older books, older shortlists are quite interesting for that, and it makes me wonder, you know, in a good few years' time, is it going to be quite tricky to track down something that was on the 2014 long list? Potentially. But either way, I hope you've enjoyed listening to me ramble about this. I've been Bob, talking about the Booker Prize. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.